We'll get started, everybody. Thank you so much for joining. I'm going to share my screen here, and Graham and Wallace and I we had a really nice conversation the past hour doing a kind of a podcast recording speaking about this study, and really encourage you. That'll be on our website, iti.com, here in the next few weeks. But, we were reflecting on how the world has changed just so much since ConExpo when this paper was launched. And probably most of you are calling in remotely. We're all remote, kind of sheltered in place. But hopefully you and your families are doing well. And, I'm hopeful that the country and the world can get back to safe work very soon. But anyways, thanks for joining us today. We're going to be, what you signed up to hear about was a really groundbreaking study that really pioneered by Graham and Wallace and the folks from ANSI, and obviously the whole team behind the National Commission for the Certification of Crane Operators, and then a lot of folks around ITI, as well as Cirrus Labs up in Edmonton, Alberta. So we'll get into all of that, but basically the study was published during the ConExpo week, and it's titled Virtual Reality's Role in Crane Operator Certification Testing. So we're going to do kind of introduce each other here as we go, but again, I'm Zack with ITI. If you don't know much about us and why we got involved in doing this study, we have delivered training services for quite a long time, since 1986. We obviously, virtual reality wasn't around in 1986, so we were doing it and still do a ton of hands-on training. And this is a shot of our facility in Washington State. And we do that for a myriad of different types of industries and customers. I love the hoisting space because you could be an aerospace manufacturer or a crane rental company or a maritime facility or a DOE site. Hoisting happens almost in every industry. And we produce content for not only consumption through online learning and hands-on training, like we talked about, but also even mobile now. So with the new OSHA requirement to do evaluations per make and model machine, we built Operator Pro, which allows employers and employees to do this inside of an app, which sticks with the employee forever. So in addition to logging shifts and activities as a logbook, you can track all of your evaluations in the app. So just wanted to get a little bit out about that, given the audience. What we're going to be chatting about today primarily is virtual reality. We don't have much time to give a big background on equipment simulation, but ITI has partnered with Cirrus Labs to build out a pretty robust library of crane simulations. So we partnered with various OEMs, including Liebherr, Brodersen, Link-Belt, Tadano, and Terex. In addition to the cranes, Cirrus Labs also produces aerial lifts and forklift and material handling simulators as well. What's really fascinating about the study is we were able to use, I believe, 3 different crane types initially: the lattice boom crawler, the rough terrain Tadano GR1000XL, and the Brodersen IC80, the carry deck. So Wallace will be explaining that as we get into this here. And at the very end, we might touch on where in performance testing, the certification world, there's obviously a lot of other performance tests that employers need and use outside of crane operations. One that we're currently looking at right now and doing with several construction companies is around construction hazard awareness. So this is a user actually doing an assessment, a hazard awareness assessment on construction hazards. So I had jumped out of my presentation mode, which I'll go back into now as I introduce Graham here, because my animations were flying me forward too fast. But Graham, I snapped this awesome LinkedIn post that you had made about 2 weeks ago when the paper was launched, and the study. I'm really excited for you to give everyone kind of your perspective of where this all started, 3 years ago, and where it's at today. So A couple housekeeping items before I turn it over to Graham. The paper, this is actually the cover of the paper. It's available at ITI.com as well as NCCCO. I think it's the NCCCO Foundation.org, Graham.
That's correct, Zach. It's also available on the LinkedIn, from the LinkedIn NCCCO Foundation page as well.
Yep.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. Yep. So you can go download it and read through it. Wallace is going to kind of, he's extracted several slides to explain it all. This webinar will be recorded, so you can go back and listen to it again, and obviously get the paper downloaded. And if you have questions, like any webinar, please type them in first. That's the easiest way for us to take them in, and then we'll be able to address them at the end. But again, I'm excited to have Graham here. Thank you so much for joining us, Graham. Graham was the founding CEO of the National Commission for the Certification of Crane Operators, and just recently, last year, he was awarded a Lifetime Achievement Award with that organization. He helped them from their infancy in 1995. And they're hitting their 25-year anniversary this year. And last year, he basically spun out a lot of various activities that the CCO Foundation now runs, which he's the CEO of. So, Graham, again, thanks for being here, and I look forward to having our audience hear from you.
Well, thanks very much, Zach. It really is a pleasure and a privilege, and I'm very excited, as you can probably tell, to be invited to participate in this. I know you're all waiting to hear from Dr. Judd with the results of the study, but just a few preliminary observations. As you rightly said, Zach, this is a product of the NCCCO Foundation, although the study itself has its genesis in NCCCO. So everything I'm going to be talking about today is from the Foundation's perspective. The Foundation is a completely separate entity from NCCCO, and so I am not speaking today for NCCCO at all. Everything I say is from the perspective of the Foundation. And just for everyone's background, the Foundation is a 501c3 charitable organization, and it was formed by NCCCO, and its mission is to promote industry safety by conducting the kind of research we're talking about here, in fact, even though, as I say, it had its genesis with NCCCO. But we're all about education, we're about advocacy, personnel safety, is a primary goal and a focus for the Foundation, and facilitating access to the industry by youth, by the military, by returning offenders into the community, underserved communities who may not be otherwise addressed during the normal process of education and certification, or who are simply unaware of the potential of certified employment in the construction industry. So we're very excited about it. And if you haven't heard much about the Foundation before, it's really because we haven't told you very much about the Foundation before. I'm a strong believer in talking about what we have done rather than what we will do. And today is really the first public opportunity we've had to talk about something that I think you will agree is really exciting and groundbreaking, not just in the construction community, but also in the certification community at large. And Dr. Judd will be talking more about that in just a few minutes. But just before he does, as you said, Zach, this does have its genesis. Actually, really, it goes back to October, I think it was October 2016, when ITI hosted a commissioners meeting. NCCCO holds 2 meetings of its commission and exam management committees every year, and it's a week-long event. And as a part of that, Zach, you made available to the community there a virtual reality headset. And I don't know about everybody else there. I know that was my first experience of virtual reality, and it blew me away. I think I can actually say for most people there, and don't forget, this is going back almost, well, certainly 3.5 years, it was most folks' first experience. And the immersive quality of virtual reality was just extraordinary. So we've had simulators, for a very long time in the industry. Literally, I mean, I can remember 30 years ago talking about simulator for offshore, actually for ship-to-shore cranes. I think that maybe that was the first industry that saw those in use, and then offshore, and then and so there's been a role for simulators to play of this, I would say, sort of conventional type, not in any way downgrading their impact. But I think what was so impressive about virtual reality was its immersive component quality. And so as a result of that, Zack and I had some conversations, and the lift safety zone at ConExpo 2017, so the last, not this one, but the one before that, this was the star of the show. And there we have a couple of photos. My successor, actually, Tom Sicklestill at NCCCO, is the individual with the Oculus Rift headset on, and being watched over by Joel Oliva there at the lift safety zone booth. And what really impressed me was how impressed other people were. Not just folks coming to sort of ooh and ah at these technology, but seasoned, experienced, 30-plus year veterans of the crane industry were seriously impressed. So much so, in fact, that we convened an ad hoc meeting right there at ConExpo of some subject matter experts that were attending the show to get their feel for, does this have, and this sort of led to the title of the study, and it is a question, does virtual reality have a role to play in certification testing? What really clinched it, though, I think, was when we had a visit by Dr. Roy Swift, who was then the Senior Director of ANSI Personnel Credentialing, that provides the accreditation for NCCCO and other certification programs. And he was so impressed. His very first words as he took that headset off were, "You need to do a study." And so that was the genesis. We did actually do a smaller study prior to this one, which enabled us to sort of road test the concept. And then we decided to expand it, design it, remove some of the wrinkles that had occurred during the first one, and enrolled both ITI, and we knew we needed an expert in practical exam design, development, and implementation. As I've said before, and I'll say again, that was the easiest part of this process, almost as easy as Roy Swift saying, please do a test, a study, because the first person that came to mind, and really the only person that came to mind, was the gentleman that's going to follow me now, and that's Dr. Wallace Judd. You just need to read the first 3 bullet points to get a sense of his educational background. And we have to do it for Wallace because his humility is also an attribute of his. And so he'd be the last person to tell you. But with a PhD from Stanford in psychometrics, you could probably stop right there. This is the gentleman who I've worked with now for over a dozen years. He was an ANSI assessor. That's to say he's one of the team that comes in to determine whether or not a certification program is of sufficient quality to become accredited. And he was actually so impressed with our practical exam program that he quit his job as an ANSI assessor and came to work with us with NCCCO as a consultant. He's developed tests for clients ranging from CrossFit to Microsoft. He did a spell at Apple. He's worked for Oracle, Linux, you name it. He's actually the author of more than 30 publications and books. And really, there is nobody else that could have conducted this study in the way that he has. So with that said, it gives me very great pleasure to turn this presentation over to Dr. Wallace Judd.
Thanks, Graham. I really appreciate it. I want to make sure that my screen is being shared.
Yep.
This study, I'll just give you a little background, was to see whether or not the virtual reality experience could predict how well people would perform on the actual crane. So that was our goal. Now, here are candidates that we used to evaluate this. Notice that most of the candidates, 60% were in the 25 to 44-year-old range, which was quite typical for crane operators. And the people had a lot of experience. They ranged from a few that had 0 years, that data was questionable, all the way through people who had 20 years. There were a number of those, and then some with more than 20 years. Crane experience, this is this is how many hours of experience they've had on crane. And you can see that the people who are highly experienced had more than aggregate of 30,000 hours. The cranes that we used for the study, the actual cranes are here at Tadano, a link belt and a Broderson trainer. The crane controls were modeled after the crane that they were to simulate. So here's a Tadano simulator. You can see where the controls are. Here's a headset over on the left. And there was a way to monitor what they were seeing on the desktop. The actual controls in the physical crane obviously look substantially different. The virtual controls were meant to model the controls in the crane. So if there were 3 on one side, then there'd be 3 on the other side. In this set, this is obviously 2 and 2. This is the perspective from inside the crane in the virtual simulation. You can just barely see the person down there giving signals, and you can see part of the course on the left-hand side. That's the zigzag corridor that they're going to have to take a virtual load through. Here is the perspective of the entire crane. Here's the zigzag corridor right here between the stanchions. There is a person who is monitoring the performance. The candidate is driving the crane. He's got this 5-ton weight that he has to carry through the zigzag corridor in both directions. Once he gets done with one way, has to go back through in the other way. Now, the items that are evaluated are in the list on the left. There's the initial walk around the ball. That's the headache ball, not the weight, but the headache ball goes in a barrel, actually 2 barrels. The ball has to go into a stop circle. Then they are tested on hand signals. This is the zigzag corridor forward, zigzag corridor backward, and then shutdown procedure. All of those things were tested in the virtual crane as well as with the actual crane. Now, our previous study was done at a number of different locations with all the candidates, and asked people to take the virtual reality twice and take the actual crane twice. Now notice that when they took the test with the actual crane, the correlation between their first and second score was 0.88, which is not nearly as high as you'd expect. You'd say, why isn't it 1.0? Well, it wasn't 1.0 because they're people, not machines. People taking the VR test had less correlation. So this is the correlation of the VR test 1 with the VR test 2, 0.69, not that high. There were issues with the previous study that we were able to iron out. First, there were a lot of different cranes, and not only that, but there were certain circumstances in which the controls didn't mirror the crane, the actual physical crane. There were a number of locations, and there was variability, for example, in the amount of practice that people took. There were people whose credentials were not evaluated strongly, and the instruction changed dramatically from location to location. So these are issues that we ironed out in the second study. I'm going to skip this because I'll clarify that initial classification accuracy, the classification accuracy in this case, this is just an illustration, is the people who passed, who were classified correctly. So that is 10 and 20. That's 30 people out of a total of 40 people. So the classification accuracy in this illustration would be 75%. Now, in the previous study, the initial classification accuracy was 35%. And we really wanted to see if there was something that we could do to improve that in the next study by improving the conditions and also using artificial intelligence to link the VR study results with the actual crane. So when we did the second study, we did it with 53 candidates, and you can see the classification accuracy here was 0.77. And the thing that's a little bit discouraging is if you pass the VR test, then a number of the people passed the crane test, but there were 8 people who passed the VR test and failed the crane test. That was a real problem. So we changed the cut score, and now we got it so that 19 passed the crane test if they passed the VR test, and only 5 failed. But we weren't satisfied with that. Basically, the decision consistency was 0.79, and the classification accuracy was 0.83. Well, what we were able to do is use artificial intelligence to change the weights of the domains being evaluated on the VR test and use them with different weightings to predict success and failure on the crane test. Once we used that artificial intelligence, you notice that we had 17 people pass the VR test and also pass the crane test. And with this group, only 2 people failed the crane test who passed the VR test. And we looked in detail at that and said, what's going on here? How come we have even 2 people? It turned out one of the people was a person who had never been in a crane before. He only had experience, and a lot of experience with virtual reality. So he was a gamer. And because of the fact that he didn't meet our initial conditions, we went ahead and excluded him. And our final results were 1 person failed and 17 passed on the crane if they passed the VR. Now, we weren't too worried about these people down here. It was too bad some of them failed and that sort of stuff. But here, what we were really concerned with was the decision consistency. If they passed the VR test, did they pass the crane test? And that the answer to that was with 94% accuracy, the answer was yes. If you passed the VR test, you were gonna pass the crane test. So decision consistency, this is some math for all of you who are interested in type 1 errors and the statistics, but the real critical issue is we now have decision consistency of 94% in those numbers, and that's very powerful. It means you've got a great predictor for the VR test of how people will perform on the crane test. Now, we did have a couple recommendations as a result of this, and we hope we'll be able to do follow-on studies. We want to make sure everybody gets 45 minutes practice on VR machine before they take the VR test. Some people went into the test with not in the earlier study with not enough experience. We'd like to verify adequate crane experience. Obviously, that wasn't the case with the 1 person who had 0 crane experience. We wanted to say that there should be conditions. If the candidate fails the VR, maybe they could be offered a discounted crane test. And we wanted to make sure that data was collected on the VR tests and follow up and see how they did on the crane test. Our final recommendation was this: if they had a high score on VR, then we might predict that they can certify on the actual crane. Whether or not they have to physically verify that or not is up to the certifying agency. But after the first cut point, if people did well, but not well enough to certify, then we would recommend that we allow them to test on an actual crane and see if they can, strut their stuff. If they were below the second cut point, then we recommend additional practice without any further information. That's it. Any questions?
Great. Well, thank you very much.
Sure.
Yeah, we did have several questions come in. And again, folks, if you have questions, there's a Q&A icon in the Zoom menu. So feel free to click that or even put it in the chat bar. But yeah, first question was around, I think I showed a slide of the locations of testing. So where was testing conducted? And in short, the first research we did, we had testing going on at West Coast Training, a partner organization of ours here in Washington State. And they had three different machines we were testing on. We had a simulator based there. And we also had testing going on here at our Washington Training Center. And then we also had testing going on in Texas at our Houston Training Center. So you can see the complexity of that initial research. We had, 3 different machines at one location, 2 at another location, and 2 more. So a total of 7 machines and a pretty wide variety of candidates. All the candidates at West Coast Training were basically apprentices. They were not. They do an 8-week program where people come in typically with no equipment operation experience at all. And then testing in Houston, that's primarily people that have a lot of experience, or they're actively pursuing their certification card from CCO. So with that initial research, there was a lot of complexity, and we were comparing various crane models all against the simulator, for example. So that's where the testing was going on. The whole study that Wallace is talking about, what we were calling the CCO Foundation study, was done in Houston, Texas, with 2 cranes, the Tadano and the Link Belt. Okay. Another question, Wallace, for you was, and since you're familiar with IPAF actually, is how would you advise an organization like the International Power Access Federation, or IPAF, to proceed to certify people on mobile access equipment?
Well, I think that probably the most important thing is what Graham did with the crane operators way back in 1995. And that was to create consensus around what skills needed to be evaluated, and then create a standardized environment that was laid out specifically to evaluate the crane operators. Graham, I think it took you guys 3 years, didn't it, to establish that setup?
It was a protracted process, in part because, we were blazing a new trail. There really hadn't been any concerted, successful effort to create a performance-based exam for heavy equipment operation until then. Certainly not one that would pass muster with the accreditation agencies, and that was always a goal of ours back in 95. And some of you may have long enough memories that you'll recall the written exam. The very first mobile crane written exam from NCCCO was issued without a practical test because we had the written exam in place, and we knew that this was not going to be a straightforward process of creating a practical exam. And it took another 3 years on top of the work that had already been done. So Wallace, yes, indeed, it was a process. That is not true now, I think, partly because of that foundation that's been established, for practical exam development. And typically when NCCCO puts a program together, what they'll do is they'll double track the written and the practical exam development, run it side by side with separate committees, obviously corresponding and coordinating with basically an 18-month timeline from start to finish. So it has got a lot smoother, but it's not for the faint-hearted.
So Zach, to continue with the IPAF question and add to what Graham said, I would make sure that the proctors were well instructed on how to consistently evaluate performance, because Graham set up a 2-day training course for his proctors so that they all evaluated performance identically. And I think that was another important development for CCO. So the things I'd recommend for IPAF are, one, make sure that you have consistency in the kinds of evaluation environments that people are put in. And second, make sure that your proctors, your evaluators, are well trained to objectify the responses that they see.
Great. Okay, thank you. Another question here. Should a specific number of hours become mandatory before certification is issued to ensure people have actual crane experience?
Graham, that's a better question for you than for me.
So I think the first thing we should be clear about is that nobody's issuing certification right now based on VR performance only. That is a question for NCCCO, and like I said at the very beginning, I'm no longer speaking for NCCCO. Everything that I'm saying is from the perspective of the foundation. I'm sure that question will now come up. You know, what eligibility requirements you put around certification is really the purview of the subject matter experts and the certification body. You know, one time there was actually an experience requirement for CCO when we didn't have the practical exam. But and Wallace can confirm this. Really, at its core, a certification is best to rely on the performance of the candidate on the test themselves, written in this case, written and practical. And on that basis, really alone, you're determining competency or certification. What really that question gets into is more of the evaluation piece of what is now known as the three-part qualification process that OSHA has now clearly defined. And so, you know, that question has really always been there since 95, 96, when CCO certification first became available. You know, should it be possible for someone to be certified without having any seat time? And the reality is it's not likely, because to jump into a crane and pass a practical exam, or to sit in a written test environment and pass the written test, it's unlikely. But it could happen, because theoretically it could happen. This is where the employer comes in to ensure that this individual is not only trained, not only certified, but also evaluated. And as we now know, that three-part process OSHA now defines in the crane operator environment as qualification.
Great, thank you very much. Let's see, good question in on this, on the gamer. So considering, Wallace, you mentioned the gamer person was able to successfully pass the VR test,
yeah,
and not able to pass the actual crane test. Does this mean a person with extensive VR experience would have to pass the practical exam on a crane? And how would we know if a person has extensive VR experience?
Well, that person who passed the VR crane operator's test got a 46 on an actual crane out of 100. So he didn't do very well. I think what this relates definitely to what Graham just spoke to, that you really want to make sure that people have seat time in a crane before they get evaluated in virtual reality. And then you may want to even do follow-up evaluation at the construction site. So I think it's essential that you evaluate people's seat time before you even admit them to the certification.
Yeah, and on that person, I don't recall, Wallace, if you know, but I believe they were able to sit in the simulator for 1 or 2 hours to practice in the simulator before they took the simulator exam. I don't know how much seat time they would have gotten on the real crane. We typically don't allow more than a familiarization period of 15 to 30 minutes in the real crane. So I kind of wonder if I don't know if you know this, but if they had substantially more time in the virtual crane to get practice stuff in.
I don't know the specific numbers.
Yeah. Another question here. What does this all mean? Like, what does the industry need to do with this information? What could this mean? And what are the next steps? Well,
from my perspective, I'm going to let Graham answer that because I'm sure he's got a very extensive answer. But from my perspective, it is a good model for the way people ought to evaluate whether or not virtual reality is a feasible addendum to their capabilities to evaluate people. I think the study, the way it was laid out, the way it's objectified, and the way it's analyzed are all models for this type of thing that other people in other industries should do in order to evaluate the utility of virtual reality. So, Graham?
Well, and I think that's a great point. I alluded to it at the beginning, is that I know we're talking here in a crane environment, but this does have consequences well beyond that. And I think it's very exciting that I certainly feel very excited that to be a part of an initiative that will have waves of impact across the certification community. And it's a privilege to be with Dr. Judd and ITI and others that have made their expertise available. I think I think we've got to be careful here. As exciting as these results are, you have to remember this is groundbreaking stuff. So, you know, the study in a way is modest, but it's also has significant impact. You know, 50-some candidates or 50-some tests is a pretty good number to start with. You know, at some point you'd love to have hundreds. I'm sure Wallace would love to have had even more than we had. I will tell you that not necessarily hiding, but behind a lot of the studies you read about in the newspaper every day, it seems, about some conclusion being reached about some aspect of our lives, is very often based on studies with much, much smaller samples than this one. So this is statistically, I think, a very significant study, and it has some significant conclusions. What does that mean was the question, I think. It's really up to the industry. I mean, I'm speaking from the foundation's perspective. We're really presenting this, the results of this well-designed, well-managed, well-conducted study by some serious and well-respected professionals in the industry, to see what the industry thinks and to see what the wider certification world thinks of it. And I have no doubt, as we say, in fact, the very last sentence of the study, if I can just read that, the very last words literally on this subject are, quote, "The heavy equipment industry in general and the crane industry in particular can look forward to increased use of virtual reality as more studies are conducted." So I think this is where we are. We're a bridgehead, and the world is wide open now to see, can we replicate this study? Can we use it in other forms and so forth? I will tell you this, though. I think I'm not overstepping my responsibility to say on behalf of NCCCO, on behalf of CCS certification, that virtual reality certification is not around the corner. It's not the next step. I'm sure that NCCCO will be looking at this study. The commissioners, the committees, the board of directors, subject matter experts in general will be taking a careful look at the study to see whether or not it has potential for the way future CCO exams are designed. But there's nothing decided. There's no pathway here in terms of future certification development. And just as a postscript, I think we sort of touched on this just a little bit. I think what's really exciting about virtual reality is what it can do that we cannot currently do, rather than trying to replicate what we currently do in a virtual reality environment, which is exciting in itself and has huge potential. But what can it do that we would never want to do in practice? could we create unsafe conditions in a virtual reality environment that we would never do on a practical exam? And actually, Zack alluded to this at the beginning in his hazard safety awareness programs. I think there's enormous potential in that area, and of course, to that extent, that position is derived from the first users of this technology in the aviation world. So I think it's the potential that can now be explored going forward is equally as exciting as the conclusions of this study.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Wallace and Graham both. We had a question come in during your answer about that VR can expose testing to site hazards found in the real world in a controlled environment. How can VR offer testing not capable with actual crane testing? I think you just answered that, which is great. I mean, in specific applications could include blind picks and, you know, really large, much larger, more complex cranes with luffing jibs and heavy lift systems, for example. Those cranes cost tens of thousands of dollars just to erect and set up. So to be able to add additional capabilities is absolutely true. And that goes back to the aerial lift world as well. Like, Wallace, like you hit on earlier about the aerial lift world.
Yeah.
You don't want to put people at height. Yeah.
I want to amplify on what you've just said. For example, you really don't want to put a person in a position to make an unsafe lift with an actual crane. Ask them to go pick up a 40-ton load at 100 feet away because the crane is going to tip over. But if they're reading the load chart, they would refuse to make that lift. But if you ask them with a real crane, you're risking having the crane get dumped. On the other hand, if you have a virtual crane and you say, go pick up that 40-ton lift 100 feet away, you're going to find out whether they're looking at the load chart before they make the lift. And then, you know, if you ask them explicitly, should you look at the load chart before you do the lift? Everybody's going to answer it correctly. They're going to say, oh yeah, you should. But then when you ask them to do something, now, you know, in reality, you don't want to risk it with the crane, but in a virtual context, you can see what they're actually going to do. Yeah,
you bet. You bet. Yeah, I think there's no doubt that the study, and we are still collecting candidates, by the way, so we're going to be adding more data to this data set over time, but there's no doubt the study has implications on, it's validating the use of VR in some capacity. And I would comment on that's only possible because it's super high fidelity production. You know, you can't recreate a $5 million machine that is very complex, that has, you know, thousands of potential configurations and motions and moments and forces being put on it without stellar engineering and physics behind it and stellar graphics. So I had mentioned Cirrus Labs in the beginning of the discussion, but they have an impeccable studio and group in Edmonton that built these crane sims to a very, very high fidelity level. I kind of liken it to Marvel Studios versus an indie film. You know, everyone can tell the difference, and you can't really get to the sort of realism and reliability we found without very, very solid physics and very solid graphics. But there's no telling this will unlock. The tool is here. I think, Graham, you mentioned correctly that the industry will decide what to do with it, but we are already able to tell folks that we can predict if a person takes the exam on the simulator, we can predict to about 90% accuracy if they're going to pass the real CCO exam. You know, so there's real life implications already. But I think there's additional potential for additional testing and whatnot.
Yeah, just on that point, and this is really Wallace's domain, so I'm stepping on treacherous ground for me, but what was really fascinating for me as a non-psychometrician was to discover that the goal that I thought we were pursuing was a correlation of 1.0. which is to say that if an individual takes a practical exam on a crane, and then he takes another practical exam on the exact same crane, that he would perform exactly, or she would perform exactly the same way with a correlation of 1.0. Well, guess what? That doesn't happen in real life. And so if the correlation isn't 1.0, well then what number are we looking for to make the determination that VR can play the role? So it was fascinating that sort of popped up and raised all kinds of questions. And I think, Wallace, you have very down to earth experience of that in a different environment.
Yeah, indeed. In the word processing and programming world, I've found out that, people who pass a test in the morning may fail the same test in the afternoon. I couldn't believe it when we did this with both Word and Excel skills, and I was confounded, to say the least. But yeah, people are people. They're not machines.
Yeah, Wallace, could you jump back to the slide that shows what we found from real crane test 1 to real crane test 2? So just to translate this to everybody, just to make sure it's understood, we call that the retest score correlation, I believe.
Yep.
And that was only 0.88 or 88%, I guess, correlation.
Right.
And
that's for the crane test.
Yeah.
And then the VR test had a 0.69.
Yeah.
Very low.
So, yeah.
So
yeah, very interesting.
Yeah, when we get a predictor right here of 94% down at the bottom using AI and refactoring and things like that, it tells you we're getting some really good numbers out of that predictability.
Yeah, and so everyone's clear how the first research project we did entailed a candidate taking 4 exams. They had to take a real crane exam twice, and then they had to take the virtual exam twice. So that's how we found those correlation figures. Again, that I feel like that data set still is pretty poor, just given the. We'd love to do more of that to understand if those are accurate, because I think the numbers were less than 40 people and in a very wide variety of skills and experiences as operators. But the second study really involved just a candidate taking 1 virtual crane exam and 1 real crane. And I would point out too, although it was 52 candidates, I do think that equated to, was that 52 people or 52 completions? Because I thought some candidates took more than
52.
1.
Well, they did in the previous study, they did more than 1, but not in this one.
Okay, got it. Great. Yeah, we just had some additional comments come in from the audience that, first of all, wanting to know how I can access VR, and that we certainly have simulators set up across North America and also can deploy. We've deployed a lot of simulators out to customers, so just need to follow up with ITI about that. And then another general comment was, I totally agree, VR is a great way to test the what ifs that may happen and check proper reaction to a situation, that's always been a solid use case for simulation for sure. Well, gentlemen, there's no other questions, but I really got to say thank you so much for sharing this.
Sure.
I'm excited to see that, it's odd that ConExpo just occurred and this really started right around ConExpo last time around. So we'll see where we're at by ConExpo 2022, I suppose, whenever the next one is. But 2023, yeah, okay. Graham, I want to thank you for really leading the way here and bringing Dr. Judd into the fold. It's been fantastic working with you both, and thank you everyone for joining us today. The recording will be available, and like I said, you can go find the paper. If you go to our website, you can go to the newsroom basically, and there's a press release here about this paper, and then when you click into there, you'll be able to click to download the whole study. So I'd encourage you to go do that, and everyone stay safe and have a good spring. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you, Zach.
Thank you very much.